Okay, thanks everybody for sticking with us. Aron Pilhofer is going to be our next speaker, talking about, where'd you go, apps? And good or bad?
We'll find out.
We'll find out. So anyway, thanks very much. Aron's had a long and distinguished career. His bio's in the program. I've known him for a long time. He was a great colleague at IRE way back when.
Way back when.
Way back when, and is constantly on the cutting edge of technology and journalism. So thanks, Aron.
All right, thank you. So this is a talk today about apps, mostly and specifically native apps. The title is People Love Native Apps, just not necessarily yours. The subtitle is a deliberately skeptical, borderline heretical, one-sided polemic on the assumed value of native apps for most news organizations. And I thought about this as a topic. It started kind of noodling this a few years back at the New York Times, and then when I went to The Guardian, and there I served for a year as an interim chief digital officer. And that's when I started really thinking hard about this question of native apps. And when you have to cut 250 people from an organization of about 1,000 or 1,200, you start to think about these sorts of things, about what is the value of native apps. And you're going way back into prehistory. Ever since the introduction of the iPhone, publishers have been enamored. They've been fascinated with the idea of the native app. Even though you couldn't make a native app, it was one of the very first things. Apple launched the SDK a year later, and we were off to the races. And so sort of the early days of app-thusiasm, what I'm calling chapter 1, is the great web do-over. And we all remember this. This was, to go back to the Daily. This was Rupert Murdoch's attempt to redo the web. And what do I mean by redo the web? There's this perception out there that publishers are screwed up the web. They're giving everything away for free. If we'd have just charged from the beginning, we'd all be better off today. And now with native apps and iPads and the rest, we can just do all this all over again. And of course, with much fanfare, the Daily launched. News Corp said it's definitely not an island. It will be involved in web discourse in the social world. Of course, that was absolutely untrue completely. It was an island. Other than its initial issue, nobody ever saw anything from the Daily. And of course, we all know what ended up happening to the Daily. And you think, why am I talking about things that are in prehistory? Well, all things that are old are new again. The Toronto Star just this summer finally shut down Toronto Star Touch, which was their attempt to do something very similar to the Daily. $40 million sunk into this, 30 staff laid off after 2 years. A project that was, to be very honest, sort of doomed from the beginning. So obviously apps aren't a do-over. I mean, no duh. But it seems crazy that you have to have this conversation still in 2017. And so this talk is mostly about strategy and what we're trying to accomplish and why. And so moving forward a bit, let's talk about what I call chapter 2, the loyalty problem. There's another kind of perception about native apps. And I love Ken Doctor. He's a brilliant guy, one of the best, I think, observers of digital, the business around news. And so he wrote this piece a little while ago. Readers who use apps are far more loyal and engaged, and those are the readers who are paying the freight. Here's a quote from the former CEO of the Huffington Post. People who download the app visit much more frequently. They consume a ton more content than the mobile web. This is a recent Twitter fight I was having on this subject. Apps are where all of your loyal and engaged users are. There is this perception that there's something magical about the native app, that the native app is this incredible loyalty device that you can wave your magic wand. As soon as you get somebody into your native app, they're with you forever. And if you look at your analytics, you would be very, very tempted to think that there's some truth to this. So if any of you have ever looked at your web analytics en masse, in aggregate, it probably looks a little something like this, at least at The Guardian, the New York Times, and every other news organization I know. It looks along these lines. So the dirty little secret of most websites is that a very small percentage of users generate a huge proportion of page views. The Guardian was very upfront about this. Kath Viner was very upfront about this. 15% of Guardian users generated 90% of our page views. The percentages are probably pretty similar at the New York Times, though I can't really talk about those numbers. But this is generally true of most every news site I know of. And so compare that to your typical, and this again is sort of obviously sort of made up numbers, but your phone, your app analytics might look something like that, where app users just seem to be these incredible consumption machines. They just want more and more and more, and they're constantly visiting your site, and just look at all that engagement. I actually had one colleague who I will not name, a fellow executive at The Guardian, say to me, our strategy should be moving everyone to our apps. If we can just move all of our readers to our apps, problem solved, journalism saved. There's a few problems with that, though. Is when you start digging into this, you realize there's a massive problem. And it starts with kind of this. For one thing, there is no such thing as long-tail traffic in a native app. You don't just find your way, well, at least now you don't, into a native app. Maybe eventually you will. There are ways to trigger a download with a link. But in general, you don't just go app surfing, right? You don't go get into a native app via search, via social, via referral link. That just doesn't really happen. So you're making this comparison between web traffic, which has all these other elements to it, to app traffic, which is, by definition, a very specific set of people. So you end up very quickly in a sort of chicken and egg question. In other words, are the apps encouraging loyalty, loyal users, or are loyal users the ones who are only using your app? And you sort of now have to ask yourself which is which. And I think there's some evidence to suggest that actually it's the second one. That by definition, you have to be a loyal user before you'd even consider using a native app. And so the evidence I would point to is if you actually took your app traffic, your app users, let's say in a mythical website, you've got 300,000 app users, unique users. If you were to take 300,000 of your most loyal web users, mobile or desktop, and just look at those, compare 300,000 app users to your 300,000 most loyal web users, guess what? They look pretty similar. They consume a ton of content. They come to you constantly. They're there every single day. They're very, very similar in their consumption patterns. How do I know that? Because we did this. We did this at The Guardian. It's not a perfect match. There's still the web users are maybe a notch below app users. But in general, they look pretty similar. And so you have another problem on top of this. Here's a pop quiz. Does anybody here know what the technical definition of a page view is? Anyone? If you look it up on Google Analytics, this is a surprisingly difficult question to answer, as it turns out. The answer tends to be extremely recursive. A page view is when a user views a page. Well, what does that mean? In 1996, before everything became JavaScripted up, that probably made a lot of sense. When every single page you viewed was an entire browser refresh, that made a lot of sense. But what about on ESPN, which is on the web, is a constant scroll of content from beginning to end, doesn't end. Quartz, there's content in the middle of everything. When you click on something on ESPN, it pulls up half a page of stats. Is that a page view? Is that 2 page views? Who knows? It becomes even more complicated when you think about it in terms of your apps. You hit the home screen of a news app. you've got all kinds of content there. You scroll down, scroll down, scroll down. What's a page view in that context? So when you're trying to compare, it's not an apples to apples comparison. And in fact, when I asked this question on Twitter, I got some very smart people, including Michael Donahoe, who used to be one of the lead technologists at the New Yorker. This is even he doesn't know. A slightly snarkier answer from a former colleague at the Times, but truthfully, this is a problem. You are making an apples to oranges comparison. So these analytics we use, even to say things like apps are where our most loyal users are problematic to say the least. Which leads me to chapter 3, the discovery problem. I don't know if you saw the most recent ComScore mobile app report, but it was fascinating. It was a really, really interesting read. It was just released in August, and it's eye-opening. It's eye-opening for a few reasons. And here are the top-line numbers that a lot of publishers in particular focused on. My God, look at that. Look at how much time people spend on smartphones, 50%. It's now a majority of the time they spend in their smartphone apps. And the kids these days, my goodness, 66% of the time the kids these days spend on smartphone apps. And even the oldsters, 55 to 64 are 46% of the time spent in smartphone apps. So isn't this an absolutely compelling reason for publishers to be diving into the app market? I mean, look at that. The mobile web obviously has more unique visitors, but apps blow away time on site, average time spent per visitor overall. So pretty clear that publishers should be racing for native apps. Pop quiz. On average, how many apps does a typical smartphone user download per month? Anyone know? I know someone is smiling in the audience, so I think you know. And the answer is 0. And here it is. 51% of smartphone users download, on average, 0 apps per month. Well, we sort of knew this, right? We sort of knew that getting people to download an app is pretty difficult. And in fact, if you look at it, it's almost 13 and 11. You're up into almost 70% who download fewer than 2 in a month. So already you're talking about a very, very, very narrow window for a publisher to be one of those apps being downloaded. If you look at the overall downloads of apps across, and this is from Appleizer. There's all these other services that do this. If you look across the board about who is downloading, like where news organizations fall on this, they're not anywhere to be found at all. In this case, there's not a single news app that ranks in the top 150 apps on the world charts. And so what apps are people using? Well, there they are. These are the apps that are preferred, and surprise, surprise, like 8 out of the 10 are owned by 2 companies, Google and Facebook. So these are where people are spending their time. So where's news fall? Right there, 3%. So of all time spent in mobile apps, 3% of that time is spent with news and information. So also a pretty narrow window. But let's look at this by segment. So where do news apps fall here? In only one segment do news apps even show up. And that's right there for 55 or older. That's Fox News, Newsstand, and Apple News right there with Solitaire. I will let you insert your own joke there. Furthermore, most users don't use that many apps, even if they download them. I mean, we've all had this experience ourselves. You end up, 2, 3 pages in, screens in, you realize, oh my God, I haven't even looked at this game or this thing in 2 years. I didn't even remember it was there until I was reminded to update it the other day. In fact, most users, the vast majority of users, only use 1, 2, or at most 3 apps at all. And so if you look at it by time spent, the numbers are even more staggering, right? So 96% of people use 10 apps total. Almost half only use 1, spend almost all of their time in 1 app and 1 app only, and that's pretty much across all ages. So again, that window for publishers narrowing, even further. Yeah, okay, so you're going to say, but what about that reading experience? That's the other thing you always hear about native apps. It's the best reading experience. It's the most fluid. It's the most immersive. It's the place where you can really luxuriate with the content. And yeah, I get that. But the web is catching up. This is a fairly up-to-date feature list showing what you can do with HTML5 and progressive web apps on the web today, and you're getting pretty close. There are some significant things you still can't do using the web, geofencing. You can't do proximity sensors. Those kinds of things are still not allowed, but you're getting there. You're getting much closer. Google is pushing progressive web apps very, very hard. Apple is not. Apple is lagging behind for obvious reasons. They have a very, very big investment in native apps in the App Store. Google, I think, less so. Obviously, their business model in Google is much more tied to the open web. So that makes sense. But these technologies are evolving very, very quickly. And so in, I would say, a few years, you'd have pretty close to feature parity web to native. Which leads you to chapter 4. And in fact, apps are a luxury item in many respects. And this is where it really kind of came home for me. So these are numbers from a site called payscale.com that tracks, and the actual numbers are probably not that important, but it's the relative numbers that are. These are, average median salaries for, front-end web developers. Roughly now, I've hired enough people in this to know that you're never in New York going to hire a front-end developer for $58,000. But so these are just as a rough guess, as a rough guide. That's, but you can then compare that to, Android and iOS developers. Obviously, you're paying a huge premium for those kinds of skills. And you can't have just one, right? You can't launch on iOS and not on Android. I had a friend who used to be on the iOS team at the Times, and he decided to quit. And I met him a year later for drinks, and I asked him how he's doing, and he said, "Oh, I'm not working." And I said, "What? You got to be kidding me. How are you not able to find a job?" At that time, the market for iOS developers was so hot, you could literally fall over backwards and fall into a new job. And he said, no, you don't understand. I worked for 3 months and then made 80% of what I was making at the Times, decided to stop working for the rest of the year. Basically, he was charging like a high-priced lawyer. And that's not that unusual. And so you are paying an absolute premium for these kinds of skills. So, the team that I ran at the Guardian, front-end developers, back-end developers, the iOS and Android developers always sat off kind of to the side because they were working on very specific products. They were working on only iOS or Android products. They weren't working on the CMS. They weren't working on the website. They weren't working on editorial tools. They weren't working on our APIs. They were working only on iOS and Android. You have to hire these teams. We had 18 at The Guardian. We had a team of 18 just doing iOS and Android. But of course, you can't just have that. You have to have specific APIs to serve the mobile products. You have to have a product manager for iOS and Android. You have to have design, because you can't designing for mobile, for native, is a very different thing than designing for the web, and so forth. These are very, very, very expensive teams to run. And so in a sense, these are very, 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 this is very much a sort of a luxury for a news organization. So conclusions. If most people download one or fewer apps per month, if the apps they're downloading are generally speaking not news apps, if they're spending the majority of the time that they are spending in one or two apps, and generally those aren't news apps, if the apps, like I said, if they aren't spending time in news apps, and if apps stifle newsroom innovation, this is my one little throw-in. I used to run a team of developers in the New York Times, and I can't tell you how many times we were stopped trying to do something because it wouldn't work in the freaking apps. It's really, really difficult when you have to have something that works perfectly on web, mobile web, and native apps, iOS and Android. Very, very difficult. If you have all of those things that are true, do you not have to ask, are they worth it? Are native apps even worth it? Now, if you're the New York Times and you're a global brand, I would say, yeah, they probably are. And this is from a sensor tower. They track downloads. This is like last month, 300,000. The Guardian, 90,000. Even the Washington Post, 70,000 downloads. I mean, those are fairly big brands. Those are brands that I think in that case, it's almost an expectation. If you're the Star Tribune in Minneapolis, my hometown, maybe. If you're the Philadelphia Inquirer, my current hometown, maybe. You have to ask yourself why. Why do we have a mobile app at all? What is this actually attached to? Why are we investing in this technology? Why are we supporting, why are we paying so much to do this? And that, I think, is the fundamental question that this, again, very one-sided, very hyperbolic, extremely polemic presentation is meant to leave you with, is why aren't news organizations asking the question, why? What actual strategy does their native app attach to? How are they advancing? And I wish I knew, to be quite honest, because I don't know even at the Times or the Guardian whether I could necessarily articulate that. But for those organizations, I think you can make the case just on its face. For the Star Tribune, for the Philadelphia Inquirer, for other papers, regional papers, I don't know. So let me give you an example of a case other than a big global brand where I think it might make sense, and that's Quartz. Quartz is, as you know, a small-ish but growing business mobile-first website. And they were very proud of the fact that when they launched, they were not going to do native apps. In fact, Kevin Delaney, who's the founder and editor of Quartz, again and again and again said, no native apps, no native apps. I mean, they're very smart at Quartz. They also said the same thing about having a homepage. They said, we're not launching with a homepage. We're never going to have a homepage until they did. And they didn't have apps either until they did. And I don't know if you've played around with Quartz's native app, but it's very different. It is not what most news organizations produce as a native app. It is not chunking up the day's paper into your handset, which is pretty much what every news organization, legacy news organization, news app is like. That's the experience. Quartz's is not. Some people hate it. Some people love it. Quartz's is more conversational. It's meant to be sort of emulating a text messaging experience. It'll sort of give you quippy little replies. It'll send you emoji. It's very interactive. That's the idea behind it. And again, some people think it's very shticky, and I get that. But what I think is cool about it, I think it's cool for two reasons. One, it is something different, and it is truly, in some respects, innovative, which you cannot say about many legacy news organizations' native apps. Number two, it's part of a broader strategy. Quartz has been very upfront about bots, AI, machine learning as being core to their strategy going forward. And this app is absolutely part of that strategy. In fact, they've now actually created a position in the newsroom. In fact, several positions. In fact, who was it from Quartz who was here? It was Emily was here, yeah, who's part of the bot team. And so John Keefe is a longtime public radio, WNYC. He used to run an interactive team there. Before that, he ran the newsroom, and he's now the bot developer and product manager at Quartz. He's sort of helping to lead their strategy around AI. And this all fits into a very clear, very well-articulated strategy for Quartz. And by the way, they're doing pretty well with their native app, considering how small it is. And that's my point. If we're going to have native apps, if we're going to invest in these kinds of products, we now have to get to, legacy news organizations have to get to a point where they can answer that simple question, why? Why are we doing this? What is the actual strategy? And is this right for us? Or is there a better way to accomplish the same thing? Because unfortunately, too much of the strategy rests on the tummy. It is, oh, apps are where all of our most loyal readers are. Oh, apps are an immersion, loyalty, magic wand that will solve all of our problems. And in fact, they aren't. And now I'm going to start my bonus presentation. People love video, just not necessarily yours. Thanks. I'm joking. I'm not going to do a presentation on video. Anyway, I don't know. I guess I have time for questions, don't I? I went really fast. I had a lot of coffee. Sorry about that. Any? Yeah.
Thank you. How do you think the role of the app differs between ad-supported publications versus ARPU?
That's a super good question. So I think that is a fundamental question, right? So in an ARPU-based, by the way, your presentation, I told you privately over there, I thought your presentation was amazing, because it does make that distinction. And I think for an organization like the New York Times, I think it depends on who you are. I think you can run a membership subs strategy without having a native app. But I think for a New York Times, it might be the kind of thing that you would tailor it might be a retention device. It's certainly not an acquisition device, right? It's certainly not something that is going to help you acquire readers, but it might in some ways, if you tailor it for that, if that were the New York Times' strategy for their apps, then that would make a lot of sense. But I don't know that it's a requirement for a membership, subscription business to have a native app. I'm not sure I would necessarily. I would say it depends on who you are.
But maybe the breakdown would be different in terms of who should versus shouldn't do it based on that?
Absolutely, 100%. Totally agree. Cool. I actually would love to know what your answer to that would be.
Are there any, I mean, most apps are functional on my phone. So I'm doing something. The news ones are, the better ones are, well, they have, I mean, I like them if there's like no ads or I can go more deeply or something, but usually it's a bad version of the site. So which I think might be your point. But are there niches besides, you just mentioned two, but are there some other ones?
Where native apps make sense? Yeah, I mean, we just saw an amazing presentation about where native apps in a museum setting, where a native app makes total sense. Not necessarily because the app, because not necessarily because of some sort of a business strategy, but because of the technology. And in that case, it makes complete sense. I mean, if there are key pieces of functionality you can only do in a native context, then it makes total sense. So yeah, absolutely. And I mean, Quartz is the example that I was sort of citing, that is like, this is an example of where it makes sense. Or at least they think it makes sense. It's tied to a business, it's tied to an actual business and content strategy.
Okay. So Mark Zuckerberg recently said, and as one of the #1 app purveyors right now, that the age of the smartphone, that in 5 or 10 years there won't be a smartphone. We'll all be wearing glasses. All right. Clearly, he's thinking that's going to be Oculus powered, whatever, and then they'll have the platform of the future, right? Knowing that and seeing how everybody kind of jumped on this app bandwagon, right? When Apple changed everything, how would you suggest that what criteria should news organizations have for the next big paradigm shift?
Yeah.
Because this is going to keep happening.
Yeah, it is. And so I think we tried to do that a bit at The Guardian in a different context, one that you're very familiar with, which is VR and AR and 360. And so the team that I ran at The Guardian, we did a very, very expensive piece of VR called 6x9, which is still, I think, pretty great piece of work, if I do say so myself. I'm very proud of the team that made it. I had nothing to do with it creatively. I was the shit umbrella who kept the bean counters and managing editors at bay. That was pretty much my job. But it was really, truly, I think, an amazing piece of work. And people often come up to me and say, wow, that was, as recently as last week. I can't imagine how much you guys spent on that. Well, actually, The Guardian spent about $10,000 on it. Well, that's the truth. We ended up spending almost nothing, relatively speaking, on it because we were able to fundraise around it. We were able to get some grants to do it. We were able to bring on a team to work with us to make it. That they gave it to us well below cost. But what that did was it told us, okay, this is what it takes to create a great piece of VR. But then the next obvious question was, oh, how do we monetize this? Look what the New York Times is doing. The New York Times has just launched their whole VR thing. They're giving out cardboard. Why are we not part of this? And I got so sick and tired of, huh? And they launched an app, yeah. Well, in some cases, there's another example where you almost have to. I think at some point you will be able to do, you would know much better than I when web VR will catch up to, but at least right now, you have to have some sort of a native container. To do any kind of serious, Unity, you really have to do it all in the context of a native experience. So, but I got so sick and bloody tired of getting emails and having this endless conversation about, well, the New York Times is doing this. The New York Times says it's profitable. The New York Times is doing this. Why aren't we in this? Why aren't we not doing anything? I'm like, fine, so let's do this. So we were approached at that same time by Google. Because of 6x9, we were approached by Google. And they wanted to do a sponsorship with us around oh my God, I'm blanking. What's their, No, the headset. No, the other one. Daydream. Thank you. Yes, the fact that it took 3 people to remember that does not bode well for Daydream. I'm sorry to say that. Anyway, they approached us about a sponsorship. And so my pitch to the executive team was, look, I'm sick and tired of talking about this, and I don't want to go barreling into VR assuming that there's going to be this big pot of gold at the end of it, just like we did with video. Why don't we do this systematically, and why don't we do this strategically? So we created a team, a distinct team, that was a combination of business people, marketing, and editorial people. And we put together a plan. And we said, we are going to explore this for 18 months. And we are going to produce this much content. And we are going to work in the following way. And the goal of this is to produce great editorial, but also to make money. And we said that, to make money. And if either of those things end up being untrue at the end of 18 months, we'll kill it. That's the deal. And we took that to the executive team. The Guardian invested a bit in that as well, and off they went. And that And then, of course, I left, so I can't tell you how that worked out. But that was, to my mind, that was trying to avoid exactly what you're asking about. How do you avoid this inevitable situation of 5-year-olds running at a soccer ball? And I mean, that's, I hope, kind of what I'm trying to get across is just like, let's attach this to some kind of actual strategy for a change, which is really, really, really not something that legacy news organizations are great at doing, except The Onion.
One more. So what do you think about offsetting what you can't do, investing in IA or AMP or any of these, or notifications now, flavor of the week, like browser notifications? Like, they're all so limiting in terms of use case and specifically revenue use case, but
Right.
use case overall, like there's less functionality by far in AMP than there is. So like, I don't necessarily see one as a viable replacement for the other.
Right.
So if your goal is to be able to disseminate breaking news or do things like that, I guess the one quibble I would have with the polemic is just like that it doesn't seem like there's another viable option the more sophisticated the newsroom gets.
So I would say there's probably a handful of, I mean, I think it kind of, at least in my head, boils down to a handful of features. So notifications would be one, right? And that's the one that people always, now they throw up, right? As the, aha, okay, fine. You can do all this on the web, you can do this in the mobile web, you can do this with progressive web apps, but notifications, that's the one that people throw up. Yeah, you're right. That is an issue. I don't know about your habits with notifications. I've turned them off on virtually every news app I have except one, which is the New York Times, because I am sick and effing tired of having every goddamn app notify me about everything. And so I think we've reached kind of peak notification also. So you're right. There are certain things you cannot do except for a native app. And I think this is where you sit and you say to yourself, okay, well, let's put this on a return on investment scale. If we invest in a native app, what does that give us? That gives us notifications. It gives us some other functionality you can't get as much in a non-native environment. True. But what do we have to spend in order to get that? And does it balance? And unfortunately, news organizations do not do that. They don't do that math. And there may be a perfectly good reason to do notifications, and there may be a perfectly good reason for a smaller newsroom to invest in an app because of notifications, but we're not even doing that math. So I don't want you to take away from this that I'm saying nobody should ever make, except for the New York Times and the Guardian, nobody should ever make native apps. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is know why you're making a native app. Quartz knows why it's making a native app. I don't know that many news organizations know why. That's actually what I'm saying. So I'm not exactly saying don't do it. Yeah?
That makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Whew. Anything else?
Can you talk actually about the state of interactives? You mentioned the VR and how you're moving into that, and I've just discovered the 6x9 quite recently, so I was looking at that. But you were at the New York Times before that, and so 2013 is when Snowfall broke, and that was really kind of the big snowfall of all
That
of
was
this.
also going to save journalism.
Right.
Yeah.
So could you talk about kind of this, how digital interactives have been, the process of how those have been moving along and where they're going and what you see as the future of those?
Just of interactives and immersive experiences like that?
In general, within news sites, but not only, I guess outside of that as well, because it's like a lot of different news organizations have really picked up on that
Right.
in different ways. And so I
Right.
think some very, very successfully and others just kind of, okay, that's kind of lame. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I would say the same about that I would say about apps or video or VR or anything else. In fact, Snowfall is one of the examples I often cite. Now, my team had nothing to do with Snowfall. Snowfall was one of the most amazing reading experiences I have ever had, and it was absolutely gorgeous and beautiful. And I will defend it forever because anybody know how long that piece was? Anyone know off the top of your head how long John Branch's Pulitzer Prize winning 13,000 words, you're off by 6,000 words. Yes, that was 19,000 words of text. Now, people say, oh, it was so expensive. Oh my God, how did you spend all that time doing it? We got the same exact stuff we always get on these kinds of things. Well, if we'd have put 19,000 words of text in a standard New York Times article template at the time, there would have been 21 pages of pagination. 21 pages of pagination. Okay, so we can agree bad reading experience. So on its face, there was a good reason for doing Snowfall, okay, the way they did it. Absolute. Where I think it kind of broke down was the strategy. So what were they trying to achieve in building an experience like that? They were trying to improve the experience of reading long-form journalism online. And the problem is we didn't actually know at the end of that whether that was achieved or not. We didn't know really whether people read the piece or they just zipped through and looked at all the interactives, as many people will say, without, by the way, any data whatsoever. That's another thing that you often hear. Snowfall, people just kind of zipped right through it and looked at all the graphics, and that was that. But people don't know that. The thing is, we don't know. And that is actually, again, that's kind of the problem. So Snowfall, I sort of put in the same category as 6x9. I sort of put it in that R&D category, where you do it just to see what it takes to do it. But then the next question is, all right, if we're going to do this, then do we actually have a strategy around long-form journalism and the presentation of long-form journalism and the integration of interactive content with long-form journalism? And I'm not sure that we ever did get to that point. Because before you knew it, there was ScrollKit and all of these off-the-shelf Snowfall in a box and all the rest of it. And then everybody got sick of Snowfall and nobody did it anymore. And it sort of became sort of a static template. But I would put that sort of in the same category as anything else, as any kind of innovation, really. Is that, we often talk about innovation. We use the word interchangeably. We often use the word innovation to mean, oh, that's cool, that looks nice. But actually, what I think of innovation is it means it's a measurable improvement on something that's core to your business or to your strategy, editorial or your business strategy. And that's the piece I think we keep missing. I would have loved to know how people, in fact, responded to Snowfall. Well, how people would have responded to it if we'd have put it in a standard article template. I mean, I think I probably know the answer to that. But what's the return on investment on those kinds of things? I don't really know. But we should know.
What user data or usage data do you get from apps that you would not get from a mobile web?
Oh, that's a great question for somebody not named Aron. I, honest to God, could not even begin to tell you what you can get from apps that you couldn't get from the web. I mean, I think there are things you could get that are inherent to the app environment because you've already downloaded it and it's already sitting on your device that you, I guess in theory, could get. I'm not really sure. That's a great question. I'm sure there are things you can get, but I wouldn't begin to know.
Actually, the reason I asked that was about 3 or 4 years ago, that was given as often a main reason for using an app.
Yeah, that could be a reason. I mean, in an app environment, I suppose you could argue that the app environment, once you've committed to the app, you're more likely to sign in, and therefore you're more likely to give
your location.
Yeah, exactly. Enable that kind of thing. I just don't know that news organizations are really using that data anyway.
Yeah.
So if they are, I know we weren't at the Guardian certainly, for various reasons. But what Daniel might know.
Yeah. So the standard app things. All right. The standard app things like Flurry give you mostly the same kind of stuff you get on the web. You have a little bit more unique user information because unlike the web, you actually know who your unique users are.
Right. Well, you know the unique device, right?
Well, unique device, yeah. I think you actually can get a unique user if you want a unique Apple account. You don't know what the Apple account is, but you can get a unique if you enable sign-in across the devices. But nothing that, newsrooms use such a teeny fraction of what we get on the web. like a teeny slice of what's possible on the web.
I mean,
It's really good for debugging. You can get all kinds of great device debugging information, but that's not really.
There are lots of, I guess Flurry is like Crux, right? Is a third party. So we used Crux.
Yeah,
Right?
same-
So
same
that's
thing.
what we used at The Guardian, which allowed us to attach unique to track users across devices and try to understand, well, this user's on the app, is this other, get some basic demographics, enhance our ad data, things like that. But I'm not sure it's anything you couldn't get from the web. I think it might just be easier to get it from an app. But I'm not the right person to ask. This is not even remotely my expertise. But I won't let that stop me from giving you an answer anyway. Yeah. Anything else? All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aaron. So we're back in here at 4 o'clock. In this room will be Dan Pacheco, AR, VR 360. And in the other room, 10:30, will be Megan.